The massive alien ship Harmony drifted through the darkness of space like a crystal palace among the stars. Its hull gleamed with strange metals that caught and reflected light in ways that hurt human eyes to look at directly. Inside the ship's docking bay, Ambassador Theron stood waiting with his diplomatic team. His body was tall and thin, covered in what looked like living crystal that shifted colors from blue to silver as he moved. His face had no nose, just two large eyes that glowed softly and a mouth that barely moved when he spoke. "The human ship approaches," his aide whispered, pointing to the viewing screen. The human vessel Resilience looked broken and scarred compared to their own ship. Black burn marks covered its hull, and pieces of metal floated around it like wounded birds. Emergency lights blinked red and orange across its damaged surface. "They survived an asteroid field collision," Theron said, reading from his data pad. 12 dead, 38 injured. Their ship should not still be flying. The docking bay filled with the sound of metal scraping against metal as the human ship connected to their airlock. Steam hissed from the connection point, and warning lights flashed as the systems linked together. The alien crew stepped back, unsure what to expect from this new species they had never met before. The airlock door opened with a loud clang. Captain James Mitchell stepped through first, his blue uniform clean and pressed despite the chaos his ship had just survived. His dark hair was combed perfectly, and his face showed no signs of the stress he must have felt. Behind him walked Lieutenant Emma Clark, a woman with red hair pulled back tightly and green eyes that seemed to see everything at once. She carried a black case with their diplomatic papers and never once looked around nervously like most species did when visiting alien ships for the first time. "Welcome to Council Space," Theron said in his strange singing voice that sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "We offer our sadness for your people who died." Captain Mitchell nodded once, his face as still as stone. "Thank you, Ambassador Theron. We are grateful for your help and hope to build friendship between our peoples." Theron studied the human captain carefully. Most species who had just lost crew members would show some sign of pain or anger or fear. Their skin would change color, their breathing would be fast, their voices would shake. But this human looked exactly the same, as if nothing bad had happened at all. "Please follow me to the meeting room," Theron said, leading them through corridors that curved and twisted like the inside of a seashell. The walls glowed with soft light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The meeting room was large and circular, with chairs that changed shape to fit whoever sat in them. A large window showed the stars outside, and in the distance they could see the damaged human ship being repaired by small robot workers. "Tell us about your journey here," Theron requested as they all sat down. His aide, a creature that looked like a walking tree with silver bark, began recording their conversation with a device that floated in the air. Lieutenant Clark opened her case and pulled out papers covered with human writing. "Our ship was exploring new trade routes when we hit an unexpected asteroid storm. The collision damaged our engines and life support systems. We lost 12 good people, including our chief engineer and 2 doctors." She spoke as if she was reading a grocery list, her voice never changing tone or speed. Theron's large eyes grew wider. Most species would be crying or angry or at least speaking faster when talking about their dead friends. "This must have been very hard for your people," Theron said, testing them. Captain Mitchell's jaw moved slightly, so quickly that Theron almost missed it. "We mourn our fallen, but we must focus on the living. That is our way." For 3 days the talks continued. The humans never raised their voices, never showed anger when the aliens asked for things they could not give, never seemed sad when talking about their losses. They discussed trade agreements like robots, talking about metal and food and technology with perfect calm. On the second day, Theron watched Captain Mitchell through the window as the human looked at his damaged ship. The captain stood alone for an hour, perfectly still, watching the robot workers replace the parts where his people had died. His face never changed, but Theron noticed that his hands were held tightly behind his back, and his fingers were pressed so hard together that his knuckles were white. "Strange," Theron told his aide that evening. "They feel pain but they hide it completely. Even our warriors show some emotion in battle." Lieutenant Clark worked 18 hours each day, reviewing papers and making notes, never complaining about being tired. When Theron asked if she needed rest, she smiled and said, "We do what needs to be done, Ambassador." On the final day they signed the basic agreements. The humans would be allowed to trade in council space and could ask for help if they found trouble. In return, they would share some of their technology and help with dangerous work that other species found too scary. As the humans prepared to leave, Theron gave them supplies and directions to the nearest council station. "Your people are very strong," he told Captain Mitchell. "You do not break under pressure." "We carry what we must carry," the captain replied, shaking Theron's crystal hand. Thank you for your kindness to strangers. After the human ship left, Theron made his report to the council. They are useful, he wrote. Very controlled and stable. Perfect for dangerous work. They do not panic or break down like other species. The council marked humanity as emotionally reliable in their files, not knowing they had completely misunderstood what they had just witnessed. 3 years had passed since first contact, and humans had spread across council space like seeds carried by a strong wind. They took jobs that made other species nervous, worked in places that were too dangerous or too sad for most aliens to handle. The council members began to see humans as the perfect workers for their worst problems. Commander Robert Hayes stood on the bridge of the Karathi mining ship Deep Strike, watching his human crew work in the toxic asteroid fields of the Vega system. Through the thick glass windows, he could see his people in their heavy white suits, drilling into rocks that glowed with deadly radiation. The Karathi aliens who owned the mining operation stayed safely inside the ship, their blue skin too sensitive to handle even small amounts of the poison that leaked from the asteroids. How do your people work so long in those conditions? Asked Captain Zell, the Karathi ship commander. His voice was high and musical, like a bird singing, but Robert could hear the worry in it. Robert watched his crew work for a moment before answering. We do what needs to be done, Captain. The minerals you need are in those rocks, so we go get them. But the radiation levels would kill most species in 6 hours. Your people have been out there for 14 hours straight. They know the risks, Robert said simply. Through his earpiece, he could hear his team leader, Sergeant Mary Thompson, giving quiet orders to the mining crew. Her voice was steady and calm, even though Robert knew she was working with a broken rib from yesterday's accident and had not slept in 36 hours. Team 3 moved to Sector 7. Team 1, you have 20 more minutes before rotation. Mary's voice never showed the pain or tiredness she must be feeling. On the other side of the galaxy, Dr. Margaret Wells worked in the Emergency Medical Center of Station Omega 7. The station sat at the crossroads of 5 major space lanes, so it saw accidents and emergencies from dozens of different alien species. The medical bay was always full of creatures with injuries that would make most doctors sick to their stomachs. Dr. Wells, we have incoming casualties from the transport crash, her assistant, a tall alien called Nurse Kex, announced. Kex's tentacles moved in patterns that showed he was nervous. 15 injured Zilani, 3 critical. Margaret looked up from the Valdrani patient she was treating. The crystal-skinned alien had been hurt in a construction accident, and pieces of metal were stuck deep in his chest. Put the critical cases in rooms 1, 3 and 5. I will be there in 10 minutes. She worked on the Valdrani for another hour, carefully removing each piece of metal while the alien's family stood nearby, their crystal bodies flashing with colors that showed their fear and worry. When she finally finished, Margaret's hands were covered in the alien's strange blue blood, and her white coat was stained and torn. Doctor, you have been working for 22 hours, Nurse Keck said quietly. Perhaps you should rest? Margaret washed her hands and moved toward the next patient. The Zilani are still critical. Rest can wait. She worked for 8 more hours, saving 2 of the 3 critical patients and helping treat the others. When she finally sat down to eat, her hands shook slightly as she lifted her cup, but her face showed nothing of the sadness she felt for the patient she could not save. Lieutenant David Stone found himself in charge of the biggest evacuation in Council history when the star near Nexari Colony 7 began to collapse. 50,000 aliens lived on the planet's surface, and they had maybe 6 hours before deadly radiation would cook them all alive. How many ships do we have? David asked the Nexari commander, Admiral Korvax. The admiral was a tall, thin alien with 4 arms and skin like polished metal. 43 transport ships, but they can only carry 30,000 people total, Korvax replied. His voice made a sound like metal scraping against metal when he was worried. David looked at the numbers on his computer screen. Simple math told him that 20,000 people were going to die if they could not find more ships or make more trips. Around him, alien officers were starting to panic, their voices getting higher and their movements becoming fast and jerky. Contact every ship in the system, David ordered calmly. Military, civilian, cargo ships, everything. Tell them we need emergency transport capacity now. For the next 5 hours, David coordinated the evacuation like he was organizing a school field trip. He never raised his voice, never showed panic, even when the star began to pulse with dangerous energy that made their instruments scream warnings. He watched thousands of aliens board the ships, families crying as they left their homes forever, children scared and confused by the rushing around them. When the last transport ship lifted off from the planet's surface, David was still on the ground, making sure no one was left behind. He rode up to the evacuation fleet on the final shuttle, just minutes before the star exploded and turned the planet into burning rock. Remarkable, Admiral Korvax told the other council leaders later. The human never showed fear, not once. Even when we thought we might not save everyone, he just kept working. By the end of the third year, humans had become the galaxy's go-to species for impossible jobs. They worked in places too dangerous for others, handled situations too stressful for most aliens, and carried burdens that would break other species. Captain James Mitchell, now promoted to Galactic Liaison, became the perfect example of human strength. In 3 years of service, no alien had ever seen him lose control, show anger, or break down, even though he had lost 4 ships and 137 people under his command. The aliens thought they understood humans perfectly, strong, reliable, and emotionally unbreakable. They had no idea how wrong they were. The Kepler research station floated in space like a giant metal flower, its 5 arms reaching out toward the dying star that scientists from 7 different species had come to study. The star was old and sick, and the researchers wanted to understand how it would die so they could predict when other stars might do the same thing. Dr. Margaret Wells walked through the medical bay, checking on her patients from the morning's small accidents. A Karathi scientist had burned his blue hands on some equipment, and a young Valdrani researcher had cut herself on broken glass. Normal, everyday problems that she could fix easily. Dr. Wells, her assistant called from the communication center. Captain Reed wants to see you in the command center. Margaret found Captain Thomas Reed standing in front of the big viewing screen that showed the star outside. The star looked different today, smaller somehow, and its light seemed to flicker like a candle in the wind. The star is acting strange, Thomas said without turning around. The science team thinks it might collapse sooner than we expected. How much sooner? Margaret asked. Maybe today. Maybe in an hour. They are not sure. Before Margaret could answer, alarms began screaming throughout the station. Red lights flashed on every wall, and a computer voice began speaking in the 7 different languages used by the station's crew. Emergency. Stellar collapse detected. All personnel to evacuation stations. Thomas grabbed his communication device. All security teams begin emergency procedures now. This is not a drill. Through the viewing screen, they watched the star suddenly get much smaller, like someone had squeezed it in a giant fist. Waves of invisible force rolled out from the dying star, hitting the station like ocean waves hitting a small boat. The whole station shook and twisted, and Margaret heard metal breaking somewhere in the distance. Hull breach in Science Section 3, someone shouted over the alarms. We are losing air fast. Thomas ran toward the damaged section while Margaret headed to her medical station. She knew that when things went bad this quickly, she would have many injured people to help very soon. The station shook again, harder this time. The lights went out for a few seconds, then came back on much dimmer than before. Margaret could hear aliens screaming in fear and pain from different parts of the station. Medical emergency in Section 5, her communication device crackled. Multiple casualties. Margaret ran through corridors that were now filled with floating pieces of broken equipment and drops of water that had escaped from damaged pipes. The artificial gravity kept turning on and off, making her feel sick as she flew through the air one moment and crashed to the floor the next. Section 5 was a disaster. Part of the wall had been ripped open, and she could see stars through the hole where a window used to be. 7 aliens lay on the floor, hurt by flying metal and broken glass. A Nexari engineer was unconscious, his silver skin cut in many places. 2 Karathi scientists were holding their blue hands over bleeding wounds. Help me move them to the medical bay, Margaret called to anyone who could still walk. For the next 6 hours, Margaret worked without stopping. The station kept breaking apart around her, but she focused on saving the people she could reach. She performed surgery while the station spun in circles, making everything float in the air. She gave medicine to aliens while pieces of the ceiling fell down around them. Thomas coordinated the evacuation from the command center, even as sections of the station were completely destroyed by the star's death waves. His voice stayed calm on the communication system as he directed people to the escape ships. Section 2 is gone, he reported to the evacuation fleet waiting nearby. We have rescued 412 people so far. Still looking for survivors in Sections 6 and 7. The rescue work continued for 18 hours. Margaret had not eaten or slept, and her hands were shaking from exhaustion, but she kept working. Thomas had been running through dangerous, broken parts of the station for the entire time, pulling people out of collapsed rooms and carrying injured aliens to safety. As the station's central section began to crack apart completely, Thomas made one final search through the science wing. Deep in the rubble of what used to be the main laboratory, he heard a small voice crying. A young Valdrani child was trapped under a piece of heavy equipment. Her crystal skin was cracked and blue blood was leaking from several wounds. She looked up at Thomas with big, frightened eyes and reached out her small hand toward him. "Please help me," she whispered in her musical voice. "I cannot find my mother." Thomas carefully moved the heavy metal off the child and picked her up gently. She was so light, like holding a bird made of glass. As he carried her toward the last evacuation shuttle, he could hear her crying softly against his chest. When Thomas reached the shuttle bay, Margaret was waiting with medical supplies. She took the injured child from his arms and began checking her wounds. "She will be okay," Margaret said quietly. "Scared and hurt, but she will live." Thomas looked around the shuttle bay at all the survivors they had rescued. Families holding each other, injured people being cared for by friends, children crying for parents they might never see again. 612 people saved. 200 lost forever. Something inside Thomas finally broke. He fell to his knees on the metal floor of the shuttle and began to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, loud sobs that came from somewhere deep in his chest. His whole body shook as months and years of held-back sadness and fear finally came pouring out of him. All around him, aliens from 7 different species stopped what they were doing and stared. They had never seen a human cry before. Margaret knelt beside Thomas, her own tears flowing down her face as she held both him and the small Valdrani child. For the first time since joining the galactic community, humans were showing their hearts to the universe. Ambassador Theron found Captain Thomas Reed in the medical bay 6 hours after the rescue shuttle had docked with the main evacuation fleet. Thomas sat beside a bed where the small Valdrani child was sleeping, her crystal skin slowly healing under the special lights that Dr. Wells had set up. The child's mother had been found among the survivors, and she was sleeping in the next bed, exhausted but alive. Theron's crystal body shifted colors from blue to worried purple as he approached. His large eyes had not stopped glowing brightly since he witnessed Thomas break down in the shuttle bay. In all his years as an ambassador, he had never seen anything like it. "Captain Reed," Theron said softly, not wanting to wake the sleeping child. "We need to talk about what happened." Thomas looked up from his chair. His eyes were still red from crying, but his voice was steady again. "What do you want to know, Ambassador?" "Your breakdown," Theron said carefully. "Your people are known for being emotionally stable. This display of distress is very concerning to the Council." Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching the child's chest rise and fall with each breath. "Concerning? We just watched 200 people die, Ambassador Theron. We held children as they asked for their dead parents. How is being sad about that concerning?" Theron's crystal features shifted in confusion. "But your species does not show emotion. You are disciplined, controlled. In 3 years, no council member has ever seen a human display such feelings." Dr. Margaret Wells looked up from her medical computer where she was updating patient records. She had been listening to their conversation, and now she set down her work and walked over to them. "Controlled," Margaret said, her voice carrying a strange mixture of tiredness and anger. "You think we do not feel anything? You think we do not hurt when our friends die, when children cry, when we fail to save someone? But you never show these feelings," Theron insisted. "You work in dangerous places without fear. You handle death and disaster without breaking down. Your people are emotionally limited compared to other species." Thomas stood up from his chair, and for the first time, Theron saw real emotion flash across the human's face. Not sadness now, but something that looked almost like anger. "Limited," Thomas said quietly. "Ambassador, we feel everything. Every death, every injury, every time we fail someone. We carry it all inside us, every single day." "Then why do you never show it?" Theron asked. Margaret joined Thomas, and her green eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Because someone has to do the work. Someone has to go into the dangerous places, handle the impossible situations, carry the weight that others cannot bear. If we broke down every time we felt pain, who would save the people who need saving? But how do you function while feeling so much?" Theron's voice was barely a whisper now. "We compress it," Thomas said, placing his hand gently on the sleeping child's forehead. "We take all that pain and fear and sadness and we push it down deep inside ourselves so we can keep working. We do not cry because we are weak, Ambassador. We cry because we have been strong for too long." The words hit Theron like a physical blow. He had completely misunderstood humanity. They were not emotionally empty at all. They were emotionally overloaded, carrying crushing psychological weights while still performing their duties with perfect efficiency. My God, Theron breathed, using a human expression he had learned. You have been operating at maximum emotional stress this entire time. Not because you cannot feel, but because you feel everything. Thomas nodded slowly. Every human in your service is carrying trauma that would break most species. The miners working in radioactive fields know they are shortening their lives but do it anyway because the minerals are needed. The doctors treating casualties see death every day but keep working because people need healing. The soldiers coordinating evacuations watch thousands die but stay focused because millions more need saving. Dr. Wells sat down heavily in a nearby chair. We learned early that the galaxy is a hard place. Someone has to make the difficult choices, do the dangerous jobs, carry the emotional weight. We do it because we must. But at what cost? Theron asked, his crystal body now flashing bright red with alarm. Margaret looked at him with tired eyes. The cost is what you saw today. Eventually we break. The pressure becomes too much and all those compressed emotions come pouring out at once. We do not cry from weakness, Ambassador. We cry when we have reached the absolute limit of what any being should have to endure. Theron began to pace back and forth, his mind racing as he processed this new understanding. Every dangerous assignment we have given you, every impossible mission, every time we said humans can handle this because they do not break down. You were asking us to carry burdens that would destroy other species, Thomas said simply. And we did it because that is who we are. The revelation spread through the evacuation fleet like wildfire. Xenopsychologists and alien doctors began reviewing years of human interactions with new understanding. They discovered signs they had missed before. The way human hands sometimes shook when they thought no one was watching, the slight tightening around human eyes when discussing casualties, the careful way humans spoke about their losses. Dr. Vexani, the chief Karathi psychologist, reviewed her files on human workers in disbelief. They have been functioning at psychological stress levels that would cause complete mental breakdown in most species. Not because they cannot feel emotion but because they feel too much and have learned to contain it. Within days, the news reached the highest levels of the Galactic Council. The species they had thought were emotionally limited were actually the most emotionally resilient beings they had ever encountered. Humans did not lack feelings, they had learned to carry impossible emotional loads while still completing their missions. The galaxy would never see humanity the same way again. Within 1 week of the Kepler station disaster, every human working in Council space received an urgent message. They were all being called back to the main Council headquarters for what the aliens called reassessment interviews. The message was polite but firm. This was not a request. Captain James Mitchell stood in the great assembly hall of the Council headquarters, facing a semicircle of the most powerful alien leaders in the galaxy. The room was enormous, with walls that curved up toward a ceiling covered in lights that looked like stars. Representatives from dozens of species sat in chairs that changed shape to fit their different bodies. Ambassador Theron sat in the center, his crystal skin flashing nervous colors of purple and gold. Beside him sat Elder Morgath of the Nexari, her 4 metallic arms folded carefully, and High Commander Zell of the Karathi, whose blue skin had turned pale with worry. Captain Mitchell, Theron began, his voice echoing strangely in the huge room. We have brought you here because we realize we have made a terrible mistake. We need to understand what we have done to your people. James stood perfectly straight, his hands clasped behind his back in the military position he had held for so many years. His face showed nothing of what he was thinking. What mistake would that be, Ambassador? Elder Morgath leaned forward, her metal skin gleaming under the lights. We thought your people did not feel emotions the way other species do. We gave you the most dangerous jobs, the most stressful assignments because we believed you could handle them without psychological damage. We handled them, James replied simply. At what cost? High Commander Zell asked, his musical voice carrying a note of sadness. Captain Reed's breakdown at Kepler Station has opened our eyes. We now understand that humans do feel emotion, perhaps more deeply than any species we know. James was quiet for a long moment. Around the assembly hall, hundreds of alien eyes watched him carefully. Some species had large eyes that glowed, others had multiple eyes that moved independently, and a few had eye-like organs that humans did not fully understand. But they were all focused on him with the same expression, guilt mixed with desperate curiosity. You want to know what it costs us, James said finally. It was not a question. Yes, Theron replied softly. Please help us understand. James looked up at the star-covered ceiling, and for the first time since the aliens had known him, his perfect composure began to crack. His jaw tightened slightly, and his breathing became just a little bit deeper. Every night, I dream about the faces of the people I could not save, he said quietly. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, who died in the engine room of the Resilience during our first meeting. Dr. Paul Chin, who was killed in the mining accident on Vega Station. Commander Lisa Hayes, who gave her life evacuating civilians from the Nexari colony. His voice remained steady, but several aliens in the assembly noticed that his hands, still clasped behind his back, were pressed together so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. I remember all of them, James continued. Their names, their faces, what they said to me in their final moments. Every human in your service carries the same weight. We remember everyone we lose, every mission that goes wrong, every time we fail. But you never showed this pain, Elder Morgath said, her metallic voice filled with something that sounded like horror. Because someone has to do the work, James replied, looking directly at her with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than his face. The galaxy is dangerous. People need rescuing, colonies need defending, impossible problems need solving. If we broke down every time we felt pain, who would handle the emergencies? High Commander Zell stood up from his chair, his blue skin now almost white. Captain, are you telling us that every human in Council service has been carrying traumatic stress this entire time? Yes. The single word fell into the assembly hall like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shocked silence that spread from species to species. We do what we must do, James said into that silence. We take the dangerous assignments because they need to be done. We work in the toxic mines because the minerals are needed. We coordinate the disaster responses because people need saving. We carry the emotional weight because someone has to. Ambassador Theron's crystal body began flashing rapid colors that showed extreme distress. Captain, when humans finally cry, when they finally break down like Captain Reed did, what does that mean? James met Theron's glowing eyes directly. It means the situation has become truly impossible. We do not break easily, Ambassador. We can carry enormous emotional loads for years, decades even. But when we finally crack, when we finally cannot hold it anymore. He paused, and every alien in the assembly hall leaned forward to hear his next words. It means things have gotten so bad that even we cannot handle them. Our tears are not a sign of weakness. They are a warning that the situation has moved beyond what any reasonable being should have to endure. The revelation spread through the galactic community like wildfire. Within months, new protocols were established throughout Council space. Humans were no longer automatically assigned to the most dangerous missions. Psychological support became mandatory for all human workers. Most importantly, a new emergency alert system was created. If the humans were crying, it meant prepare for the worst possible scenario. Their tears became the galaxy's early warning system, not because they showed human weakness, but because they proved that beings capable of incredible endurance had finally reached their absolute limit. When humans broke, it meant everyone else needed to brace for catastrophe. The galaxy had learned to watch for human tears with the same fear they once reserved for dying stars.